Apologies that we had some issues earlier on. I think it's on the platform side. I'm not sure if it's fully resolved, but here we are. And let's see if we can continue this first session. Let me just see, something just popped up here. Okay. All right. Let me just walk through some bit of a background. So this is part of our webinar series during this COVID-19 grounding period. We'll be offering these webinars weekly on topics which are selected to help build awareness of improvement methodologies and tools that we used in past. Today's topic, as you guys know, is on why projects fail, and is being presented by Carmen Sriello. He's on the stage with me right now. He's a founding member and a senior partner at Lens Improve. Has been involved in continuous improvement for over 25 years, have global experience working directly in operations, technical, and corporate environment. He's a master black belt in Lean Six, and on today's topic, has successfully applied operational readiness to various types of projects, including enterprise system implementations such as SAP, as well as startup of operations such as underground mine. Carmen is multilingual, including French, so those of you who are more comfortable in interacting in French with him, feel free. Before I hand over the stage to him, a little bit more on the structure of our talk today. We'll start the presentation on the topic. While presentation is occurring, you can ask questions that you may have in Questions tab on the right side of your screen. Carmen will keep an eye on questions during the presentation, and then we'll answer them at the end. We will also have an opportunity to talk face-to-face and discuss any further questions or interesting points that you may have through a Google Meet after the webinar. A link is in the comment section, and I'm going to also be emailing to you now. Without further ado, I'll hand this over to Carmen.
Perfect. Thank you for the intro. Yeah, hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for taking the time for joining us today, and for joining us for this topic. As you know, the topic is why projects fail, which is really an awareness level presentation on operational readiness. So you'll see a little bit of an intro to the topic. And for those of you who would like to know a little bit more, there is the possibility of chatting, asking questions. And we'll also have a little bit of time after the presentation. It's about a 10 to 15 minute video, which you can ask your questions at the end as well. I think that's about it. I think the intro took care of everything. So there's a little bit of an intro on a couple of different topics, and it is based on some work that's been done in both sort of information type projects, as well as technical mining and metallurgical projects. So enjoy the video, and we'll chat at the end of the video, as well as if you have any questions, just type them into the chat room. Go ahead. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's presentation is on why projects fail, which will be an overview on operational readiness. Let's take a look at some quotes and some studies that have been done over the years. In the 1980s, there was a study of about 35 Australian gold mines, and it was found that over 2/3 of these projects failed to deliver on the planned production. There was another study by mining.com that saw that over 2/3 of mining projects face cost overruns, which is another way of looking at project failures. Another study by Ernst & Young, which looked at these mining and metallurgical mega projects, and it looked at over 100 projects. And they found that on average, there was a budget overrun of about 62%, so a very large number. And finally, a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers, which saw that only 2.5% of companies actually deliver on the main criteria of a good project, which is deadline, costs, scope, and the benefits associated with the project. So very poor stats that were available in these studies. So what are some of the reasons why we have projects that fail? What are some of the critical causes of these project failures? So here we see a list that starts with technical and supply issues. And those ones are generally where the bulk of the attention is spent on. You know, when you're thinking of an engineering company or a project team, they will look at those first two bullets. But that, according to this study, only represents about 8% of the reasons why a project fails. On the other hand, the rest of that list, when you look at handover risks, health and safety, environment, et cetera, down the list, that's the bulk of the reasons why projects tend to fail. So the other 92% are due because of things that are related to management, managerial topics, or general project management reasons. So when you look at this entire area of the critical cause of project failures, how do we attack this and how do we address them so that we don't have those problems showing up? And this is where we enter with operational readiness. So let's start with a little bit of a definition. So what is operational readiness? It is defined differently depending where you look at. So probably an official definition is closer to this first one, which is to ensure that the capital project, usually a capital project or an asset, being delivered is capable of an effective startup, ramp up as planned, and then sustainable productive operation. So the three phases of getting it up to speed, basically. Another way of looking at it, a little bit simpler, is it functions as intended when you start it. So whatever it is that you were planning to purchase and to install, it's functioning exactly as you had hoped it was going to. Another way of looking at it is to increase the value in delivering the product surface through established systems, processes, and procedures, and also minimizing risk. You don't want to be installing this new piece of equipment or this new process and adding risk to your overall department or division. Another definition is what an operational readiness team should look like. And a key word here is it should be independent. It should stand on its own between the client side and the project side. So it has sort of a hands-off feel to it on both sides of the fence. Finally, do not treat operational readiness as a checklist. It's something that should be done properly as a system and not simply going through the motions of making sure that the elements are covered. So let's take a look at a classic system which would encompass all the elements of operational readiness. So what you would have is starting at the 12 o'clock and going clockwise. You'd have, for example, operational strategies and budget would be covered, scope and tracking, people and management, tie-ins and handover. So that's an important part of giving the project over to the client afterwards. Overall risks and contingency planning, safety, health and environment, and maintenance and materials. And the nice thing about when you deal with operational readiness in these different buckets, you deal with it at the beginning of the project. So in this case, the define phase, where you're just making sure that you understand what the different components are, and you're making sure that you haven't missed anything. You go through this as a loop, and then you do it again. You do it again in the planning phase. And in the planning phase, you're actually, as the name implies, you're planning the work. You're making sure the elements are actually touched on and covered and the work gets done to support it. And then finally, we do it again in the execute phase, which is essentially doing the actual work. So the nice thing here is if you're doing operational readiness properly, then you're doing this in multiple loops, not just a one-time pass, but in this example, you're hitting it 3 times from beginning define to plan to execute. So when projects fail, who do we end up blaming is the title of this slide. But first, what are the reasons why projects fail? So a way of looking at it, it could be caused because of delays. It could be cost overruns, poor quality, client needs not met, the market may be unhappy with the performance, or the scope not delivered. So these are some of the areas that relate to a failed project. So who we end up blaming when these things happen usually falls in one of these 4 areas. So it can start with the construction crew. We're very quick to blame the crew. Perhaps the speed wasn't there, or the quality of the work wasn't there, or not being done as planned. Engineering gets blamed for this as well, quite a bit. Planning sometimes, or speed as well. Labor gets often blamed as well, whether it be the quality of the labor or having enough people to do the project. And of course, sometimes the client also gets blamed. The client, in terms of being there for the project and actually being an active participant and not just being passive and just receiving the project. So these are some of the classic groups of people that get blamed for a failed project. So the nice thing is if you apply operational readiness and you apply it in terms of this independent way, hands-off between the client side and the project side, it can minimize the probability and mitigate the causes of having a failed project. So that's the good news. However, the question here is, even if we apply and do operational readiness properly and do several cycles and loops of it, can we still have problems because of the way the estimates are generated? And the answer is yes, we can still run into problems based on how estimates are generated. Well, let's take a look at this. So point estimates are one of the big problems with the way that information is collected. So in this example, why are financial point estimates dangerous? And it applies as well, not just to finance or cash, but also to time or labor or any other parameter. So one reason why a point estimate is dangerous is because early in the project, you probably don't have enough information to state the cost with a high certainty. So you only have a rough idea what the costs are. And as soon as you come up with a point estimate, for example, $10 million, you're showing that there's a lot more certainty in the number than there actually is. Your point estimates will hypnotize management into believing the financials, and they will hold you to it. This is a common problem. We're all human. As soon as we hear the number, in this example, 10 million, we get stuck with the number. The number is anchored in our brain, and we tend to have a hard time letting go of it. It also hides the estimation or the probability of financial failure, meaning that number that I quoted, the 10 million, has a lot of uncertainty associated with it. I'm not really sure if it is 10 million. And the fact that I only give the point estimate hides this uncertainty. And finally, it provides no information on the reality of the cost variation. So when you just give the single number, it hides the fact that there is this range or this min-max, as we're going to see in a couple of minutes, on how the number actually is put together. And of course, the worst problem with point estimates is you and your team will start believing it. So as soon as you start repeating a number, whether it's $10 million or 6 months or whatever the case may be, the brain starts hanging on to it, and you forget that there's a range to it and there's a variation to it. So the solution to this is using what is classically called Monte Carlo estimates. And in this case, we have a very simple example of a 3-point estimate. So the 3-point estimate in this example uses a triangle, something that's fairly common and easy to set up. You have a minimum number, a maximum number, and a most likely number. So the minimum can be an optimistic one if you're talking about cost, or it can be pessimistic if you're talking about returns. Opposite on the maximum side, if you have a pessimistic or optimistic number. Then most likely, as the name implies, it's the most likely outcome. So if you look at the bottom right graph, you have the minimum number, the maximum number. You notice the most likely is not the average. It's not in the middle of that graph. The most likely is simply saying the odds are the average outcome is going to be here, in this case, closer to the minimum value. And then you do this exercise for each parameter. So if you've got cost, if you've got recoveries, if you've got production numbers, if you have times, you do the same thing. You have a minimum, maximum, and a most likely number. And you do this kind of scenario for each and every one, and each input has its own risk distribution. So let's take a look at what this looks like when you put it all together. So if you're dealing with point estimates, you would be just using a number. For example, this project will be completed in 34 weeks. And that's all you have. You're not really sure what to do with that number. You're not really sure if I'm talking optimistic, pessimistic, average, most likely. What exactly am I saying when I say the project will be completed in 34 weeks? However, instead of saying the sentence, what if I showed you the graph, the Monte Carlo simulation of all the different estimates put together? So now this gives a richer picture of what the 34 weeks actually means. So what you can see here from the bottom table, it says the 34-week mark is at the 20% of this graph. What that means is that there's only a 20% chance that I'll finish the project in 34 weeks or less. Or conversely, there's an 80% chance that it will take me more than 34 weeks to complete this project. So this is very important information. It's very rich information, both for the person who's giving the info and for the receiver who wants to ask questions on different scenarios. So for instance, the scenario you may be asking about is, well, I want to be 80% sure of the time this project's going to take because I have other things to do and there's other projects that have to be done afterwards. So in this case, the chart would say, well, the 80% mark of this graph is 40 weeks. So I am 80% sure that this project will be done within 40 weeks. So this is a technique. Once you get away from point estimates and start dealing with either min-max most likely or some kind of distribution, it gives you a much richer description of whatever you're looking at, whether it be financial, project, or whatever the parameter is. So in conclusion, the main takeaway for avoiding failed projects or at least minimizing the risk to project failures, we talked about operational readiness is to make sure you have an operational readiness system, that it's used properly, and that it is sort of a hands away or hands off approach between client and projects. That you understand the risks associated with the projects, and that you stay away as much as possible from single point estimates. Deal with ranges, deal with min-max most likelies, and use that to paint a better picture of how the project will look like. Putting all this together will increase the likelihood of success. Thank you very much. I want to apologize, one of the slides was cut off at the bottom. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen just to show you what it would have looked like had it not been cut. So I will share my screen in 1 second. There we go. I trust all of you can see this. So yeah, the bottom was basically a little bit of a summary table. And the idea here is once you run the Monte Carlo, so the Monte Carlo, what we'll do is we'll take thousands and thousands of simulations of all your inputs, all your min, max, most likely inputs, and it creates this curve or this graph. And this is what I was mentioning about the richness of the conversation, right? So if I would show this to you and you were my client, there's a 20% chance of it taking 34 weeks, 50 of 36 and a half, or 80% of 40 weeks. So you're able to have a conversation. You're basically having a conversation between the project team or the operational readiness lead and the receiver, the client of this project. And based on this, you can see what the risks are of a certain decision. So if you're going to make the assumption that the project will be finished in 36 and a half weeks, it's a 50-50 proposition. It's equally likely that you'll finish before as you'll finish afterwards. And if you're risk averse because you have many things hinging on it, you have a lot of people involved that are contractors, then you probably want to go more and more to the right-hand side to protect yourself from not finishing on time. And of course, the other part of the conversation that you can have with this graph is questioning, well, why is there a spread between this min and max? Are there certain things that we could do better? Are there certain elements we could do, more homework on or more investigations in order to squeeze that curve to be a little tighter? So that's the one I wanted to show, and I will stop sharing my screen. I think I've stopped sharing my screen, hopefully. If there's any other questions, you can type them in, but I don't see any specific questions on the right-hand side, so I'll just wait a couple of seconds. And just a reminder, there are some poll questions also on the right to give us some feedback. We would be much appreciative if you give us a little bit of feedback on this.
Yeah, we'll just wait for a few. Oh, there you go. There's a question.
1 second. Oh, I should read it. Yeah. How can we make these probability percentages real and meaningful in the case where we depend upon other resources to deliver aspects of our projects? What are some examples of the inputs you refer to? Yeah, so I'll answer the first part. In terms of being meaningful, it's a really, really good question, right? So what you're trying to avoid is what sometimes happens. We all work in companies and there's politics involved in it. And you're trying to stay away from the case where you're just trying to sell the project, right? Some people get very passionate about the project they're on. So you're trying to paint a rosier picture on the project. So part of it is convincing the senior management and the executives that what we're trying to do is get an accurate picture. I'm not trying to convince you to invest in the project. I'm trying to actually come up with the real portrait of how much money it's going to cost and how much time. So that's part of the answer. The other part of the answer is, unfortunately, we do have to look at some of those details. I think during a lot of our presentations in corporate environments, we tend to just give the bullets, the high level bullets. Somebody will say, so how much money will it cost? And you're forced to give a single number or a single time estimate, right? And it takes a little bit more time. So some of those inputs and some of those outputs is to show that distribution. I often give an example. It doesn't happen very often, but I had a boss. He was an executive of the copper division I worked at, and he was a big advocate of this technique of using Monte Carlos and estimates. So once you can convince the high executives or the senior leadership of this technique, then they're also paying attention to this, right? When they're sitting in on the presentation, they don't want to slide with just a bullet. They don't want to see, it costs X dollars or it takes Y months. They want to see that spread. They want to see a range and they want to see a probability of success, for instance. So that's part of the answer. The other part is examples of inputs. Yeah, essentially, if you picture what Monte Carlo sounds a little complicated when you just look at it at that level. But essentially all it is imagine your spreadsheet. We all use Excel spreadsheets in order to do some kind of math. So in your spreadsheet, if you were trying to calculate return on investment or total cost, you would have things like, oh, well, I need labor, I need materials, I need contractors, I need whatever. There could be a list of 10, 20, 200 different items in your spreadsheet. And when you add them all up, you get a total dollar. Monte Carlo does the exact same thing. The spreadsheet would be the exact same spreadsheet, except you add two columns. So in each case, instead of just giving me, quote unquote, the most likely number, you're also going to give me the minimum and the maximum of each of those single items. So in this case, they would all be dollars, and I would want a minimum and a maximum of those dollars. The reason why it's a little skewed is because usually the worst case is much, much greater than the best case. Let's take an example of a time to install a pump. If I tell you it's 2 weeks, and then I ask you, well, what do you think is the best case? You might say, if everything goes well and the stars are aligned, maybe I can do it in a week. But if I ask you the same question in terms of the worst case, now you might say, well, instead of 2 weeks, it could be 6 or 8 or 10 if I really don't have things prepared properly or something happens. And that's why the triangles and the distributions usually look more lopsided, right? So hopefully I answered that first question.
Yeah, before you get into the second one, I just want to add to the first piece is the aspect where Mike says, when you depend on other resources to deliver aspects of your project. I think that's where it's important to have that operational readiness piece as early as possible, right? Like if you knew exactly what are each aspects of the project, who is delivering what are their input outputs, right, into what processes, then it becomes easier to have that conversation. If the input you got was too wide, your min and max were too wide, then you have time to go back and ask that question and say, why is it too wide? What is the uncertainty? What is the risk, right? And then maybe the risk is real and you need to prepare for that risk. But if you don't do operational readiness, in advance enough, like in some cases, in our experience, sometimes you're doing it as it's going live, and there is no operational readiness. It's just having a backup plan if it fails. So, anyways, that's all what I wanted to add. Is you can get started early, then it becomes easier to get those probabilities built and make them real.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. Assuming that question's okay, the next question is, does one require Minitab to run Monte Carlo simulations? I would prefer to travel there. Yes, I think we would all like to go to Monte Carlo to run the simulations. It's a very good idea. Not yet. We're still under quarantine. Yes, let me share my screen just very quickly as to, actually, I'll say something first, I'll share in a second. The world standard, if you're going to use quote unquote some kind of an example for Monte Carlo, usually is a software called Crystal Ball. So when you want the Cadillac of softwares, Crystal Ball is the one that's used commonly for Monte Carlo. The reason is it's a standalone program, and it has a wealth of options and possibilities. You can do a whole bunch of what-if scenarios, sensitivity analysis, which Austin was referring to. So imagine I have this spreadsheet of 100 or 200 line items. I can then ask Crystal Ball, can you tell me which ones of these have the most impact on my curve, on my final distribution? I'll say, oh, you know which one it is? It's actually the cost of your welders, because there's a lot of uncertainty in the numbers you put in there, for example, right? So crystal balls is part one of the answer. But what I use usually with our clients is, and I'm going to share my screen very quickly, enable screen sharing. And I will share the whole screen. Okay. And I will go into Excel. There is a what they call an add-on software, and it's called RiskAmp. And you can see it up here on my screen, RiskAmp. The reason I like it is because it fits very, very well into Excel. So everybody uses Excel. This software is relatively inexpensive and relatively easy to use because it fits right into Excel. So I don't have an example built in here, but essentially when I was saying that your Excel spreadsheet looks the same way, except you would have a min and a max instead of just a single column. So you'd have 3 columns. And then once you've built it, you can run it very easily. As you can see here, you can run the simulations, you can see some graphs. Very simple to use, very inexpensive. I will go back. So those are the 2 softwares that I normally use. Yes. So Crystal Ball and RiskAmp, much cheaper, much easier, and easier to share with your organization.
And yes, there are others. Minitab does have one of their own versions too. So if your organization is bought, you might be able to get one, right, which works better with Minitab. I can't remember the name. Do you remember the name, Carmen? The Minitab version. Anyways, they have one. And
No, they came up with it a few years ago, right? It's not that old as an add-on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Very good questions.
Okay.
We're good.
Yeah, if there's any more, not any more questions, take this, get into more social environment, please click on that link and go to Meet, Google Meet, and we can have a face-to-face conversation there. Otherwise, thank you for joining us, and we'll send you more invites based on what the next topics are.
Yeah, thanks everyone.